pop up and say hello.
We're used to trying to make ourselves presentable just in case. It's nice to meet everyone. My name is Julie Wilbers. I'm the director of ISSS. We hope that you get a lot out of this workshop. And if you need anything from us, let us know. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Petrick. I'm the assistant director at ISSS, and nice to see you all here. And just to echo what Julie said, I hope that you find this informative.
All right, and then I guess just housekeeping wise, this is for you all, so it's fairly informal. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And Julie and Andrea, if I can ask you to help monitor the chat and answer questions that are coming in through there. You can also do a raise hand and unmute yourself to ask. If it's a question that we'll come to a little bit later on, we might ask you to hang on to that till we get to that part of the session. All right, let me share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, all right, so we are going to be talking about curricular practical training today. It is one of the two types of practical training available to F1 students. One of the things that, or what we would hope to accomplish, is just to give you a basic understanding of what CPT is and how it works, how eligibility works. There's a dimension of this that will apply to you as the student who is requesting CPT, and then there's a dimension that applies to the opportunity. So we'll look at both of those things, making a plan for accessing and using your CPT, and then the application and approval process, which is going to involve both your academic program contacts and an F1 side of things for the actual authorization. Okay, so how is CPT defined? This is a regulation that has probably been the source of much frustration within the international advising community and universities altogether, just a period. The core piece of the regulation that really informs how CPT gets applied on campuses is that it's got to be an integral part of an established curriculum. And thus the curricular in the CPT. The regs define it. They put it in the context of alternative work study, internship, cooperative education, or any other type of required internship or practicum. It's offered through sponsoring employers. So they see it a little bit differently than employment, but this is all bundled into what can be curricular practical training. If we distill that down into a short little nugget, the practical takeaway is that it's some sort of structured academic experience that is a component of your degree somehow. So that means it's a little bit separate from good opportunity. So it's not the same as, oh, this is interesting and I want to do this, let me use CPT. It's not work permission for the sake of work permission. So one thing to keep in mind is that practical training can be employment. And even though CPT is on its own, it's a type of activity, it also does authorize employment. But this means that your practical training could be an unpaid experience that doesn't necessarily constitute employment, or it could be used to authorize something that is also considered as employment. When we look at sort of the distinction between training versus employment, and we apply the Department of Labor lens to that, training is really something that is benefiting the intern or the student. Ideally, this is something that's structured around your program. So it's structured around classroom knowledge or course knowledge connected to a degree requirement. Their learning goals, the training is for your benefit. There's no promise or expectation of a job at the completion of the training. And so that is really what we're talking about when we're talking about practical training, anything that hits all of or any of those markers. Employment, on the other hand, if we look at a really simple definition of that, it is payment in exchange for services. So you're providing a service to someone and they're paying you for that. There is an expectation of wages or compensation. And what you're doing is pretty much servicing or providing a benefit to the employer, more so than for yourself. It's not as much of a learning experience. And it's a regular job. So it's something that would displace a paid employee. This is Joe. Joe does X. Joe has left us. We're hiring you to do Joe's job in a simple terms. And there's an expectation for that work to continue or a promise of continued work. So practical training can authorize employment, but if we're looking at just what is practical training, it's mostly an educational experience. But that CPT permission does give you authorization to engage in employment. When we look at unpaid training, previously our policy was that you didn't have to have CPT for unpaid training, but we strongly recommended it. And the reason it was recommended is because you don't always know if an unpaid situation is truly something that USCIS would consider not to be employment. And so we've had to shift that policy just a little bit. And the best practice is for you to check in with us before accepting an unpaid situation. Oftentimes you won't know until the work has been completed whether or not it could be considered work. So it's best to just check in before accepting those opportunities to make sure that you won't need any work authorization to do that. Just because it's not paid or someone says, oh, we can do this unpaid or volunteer, doesn't mean that it truly is a situation where you don't need any work permission. And the brunt of those consequences come down on you as the student in F1 status. So our goal is to help you avoid situations where you would unknowingly participate in something that needed authorization and you don't have that authorization. Status violations can always be tricky to resolve, and they're a little bit, maybe this is too extreme, but they're a little bit like zombies. They move slowly and they're out there in the background, but they still have to be dealt with. And eventually they catch up with you. If we're looking at the classic Night of the Living Dead versus some of the newer zombie flicks. Okay, moving on from the zombie piece. So connected to unpaid training, if we're looking at volunteering. So can I volunteer? It depends on, is it just being called volunteer to avoid the work authorization conversation, or is it truly volunteer activity? And same thing here, you know, we strongly recommend that you get advising for something that is volunteer, but it's something you're doing to get work experience, because then the line gets a little fuzzy. So it's not just a matter of, are you receiving money? Are you getting any sort of compensation? So let's say maybe you get a small scholarship or a stipend, or your meals are provided, or you get transportation covered. Those are things that can change, can establish an employment relationship, can also mean that you're getting some form of compensation and therefore you need some sort of authorization for that. You also have to apply the lens of, as a person in a non-immigrant status, would this be considered work? Would this be considered employment for me? And the big thing to remember is that you're the gatekeeper of your status. So even if a company tells you, oh no, this is no problem, you want to make sure that you understand fully what's required of you as a person in F1 status, and that you get reliable advice on whether or not this is a tricky or a problematic situation for you. So again, we strongly recommend that you get advising before engaging in something as a volunteer, to make sure that it really, that you understand what the risks are of engaging in that activity. So when we look at volunteer versus practical training, and we sort of apply a Department of Homeland Security lens, as well as the Department of Labor lens. So if we're looking at what volunteer is, you know, very basic stripped down definition, this is a personal donation of your time for something that you care about. Usually this is a civic or charitable or humanitarian connection, usually done for a public agency, doesn't involve compensation of any time and of compensation of any kind, and the activity itself is not something that can be considered as work. So it's not something that an agency would usually pay for, and they're just choosing not to pay you. When we look at what might tip a volunteer situation over into being considered training or employment. So if the activity is directly related to your major field of study, and maybe you're doing this to gain professional experience, maybe you're doing it for credit or to satisfy a degree component, then we have to look a little bit more closely. Is this volunteer, or is this something that needs to be covered by practical training, or is this employment? Okay, any questions on the unpaid and volunteer piece before we move forward? Okay. All right, so how is CPT different from OPT? So when we look at the regulations, they're both practical training, and really the distinguishing piece is curricular versus optional. So curricular practical training is a pre-completion benefit only. So that means it only exists while you're working towards the completion of your degree. Optional practical training, you can use, it's a static amount of time. So you only have 12 months. You can choose to use some of that time during your program, which would be called pre-completion, or you can save it all and use it after you graduate, which would be post-completion. CPT no longer exists once you meet all of your degree requirements. CPT is employer and location specific. So that means that you've got to have the job first. You have to have that opportunity first, and then it's authorized for that opportunity and specifically for that location, whereas OPT authorizes you to do work anywhere as long as it's related to your primary field of study. Your major field of study. CPT is not processed by United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. You only have, you go through the international office to get access to that. Whereas OPT, you've got to make an application, which requires an application fee and a certain amount of processing time. One thing that CPT and OPT share, they both have to be related to your major field of study. So CPT, if we were talking in an undergraduate context, can't be applied to a minor. So it's only your major field of study as it's listed on your I-20 that you can use for the basis for CPT. CPT can be paid or unpaid, but it's got to have an academic anchor. So this is where we come back to that distinction between curricular and optional. And on our campus, that academic anchor looks like, is that a degree requirement? Is it a required course that has a practical component? Or is it an optional course that your department uses for practical components? Okay. So are you eligible? So when we take a look at eligibility, if you are an F1 student, because it's an F1 benefit, you've been full-time enrolled for an academic year, and then we look at the Department of Homeland Security policy guidance on what constitutes an academic year. And from their perspective, that's a minimum of 30 weeks of instruction, with an exception for graduate students who have to participate right away based on program requirements. On our campus, that looks like a fall and a spring, or a spring and a fall. Our summer semester isn't quite long enough to be counted towards as a full-time term towards the academic year. You're making normal progress towards your completion of your master's, bachelor's, or doctoral degree, and your program's not yet completed. So that means that you have not yet satisfied all of the degree requirements. So you've still got some courses to take, or you're in your last term taking those courses. We would not be able to give you an extension of your F1 program just for the purposes of participating in CPT, unless that's a degree requirement and you need more time to complete the degree. All right, so then when we look at eligibility, is your opportunity eligible? So then we're looking at the training. So at minimum, the training has to be directly related to your major field of study. You have to still be able to be a full-time student while you're participating. So if your CPT is going to occur during the fall or spring semester, you still have to be a full-time enrolled student. And that's either through actual credit hours or equivalent. So if you're in a program that has a thesis option, and I don't think that's an option for the data science program, but just in case, then that means either you're full-time enrolled or you're in a thesis course that gives you full-time equivalency. If the opportunity will not allow you to be full-time enrolled during the academic year, then that's really not something that we can accommodate, because that's a basic standard of the regulations that you've got to be full-time enrolled during the mandatory enrollment terms. Training's got to fit that description of being part of an established curriculum. So whenever we get an application for CPT, we're always looking for what's the academic anchor for your opportunity. So again, does that go back to a degree requirement? Does it go back to a required course that has a practical component? Or is this an optional course in your program for pursuing practical experience? Okay. And I've gotten out of sync with okay, here we go. All right, so some standard CPT scenarios, and this is campus-wide. So you're in a program that's got an internship, practicum, clinical requirement. Is that CPT eligible? Absolutely. What enrollment is required? Since if there is a course component, so if there's a designated course for that requirement, then you have to be in that course. If your situation is happening during the fall or spring, you also need to be full-time. If your program doesn't require an internship, but you've got the option of taking an internship course, that is also a CPT eligible situation. You would need to be enrolled in the internship course. And again, if it's happening during the fall or spring, you've got to be full-time. If your program has a research requirement, this gets a little bit more specific, because yes, this does qualify for CPT, but the job has to fulfill the research requirement. So then that's where we would ask for some additional information from your advisor, confirming how the opportunity is meeting that is integral to the completion of the research requirement. If a course exists for that, then you would need to be enrolled. If you've got a job offer and it's related to a course that you took last semester, this may not qualify. We have some flexibility based on cooperative education agreements, but we would have to look at that a little bit more closely. That's where you'd want to get some advising before you accept the opportunity, because it may not be something that we can authorize for CPT. This may be something you'd have to use pre-completion OPT for. If there is a way to qualify it, then we would be able to do CPT, but it would require enrollment in a course. So we'd have to identify what that would look like. If you've got a job offer related to a course you're taking right now, but that is a coursework course doesn't involve any sort of a practical component. Same thing, we'd have to take a look. If there is a way to establish eligibility based on the regulations, then we may be able to authorize CPT. If not, then this is another situation where you'd have to look at applying for pre-completion OPT. And that means that the timing will become an issue because you'd have to get that approved by USCIS before you'd be able to start. I've got a job offer not related to my major, but they're relatable skills. Sadly, this would not qualify under either CPT or OPT, because both of those programs have the requirement that the practical training has to be directly related to your major field of study. So that would not be something we would be able to authorize CPT for or recommend pre-completion OPT. Okay, so some ON specific CPT scenarios. And let me pause here and ask Brooke to just chime in. Is 6902 still an option, or has that gone away?
It is very rarely an option. Before we had the experiential learning requirement for MBAs. It was more common, but yeah, with the experiential learning requirement, I think that covers it for MBAs.
Okay. So we will fast forward past that one since it's not particularly applicable. So we'll skip the first two. If you are in a cohort that has the experiential learning requirement, you've got to fulfill that for your degree requirement. Yes, this is a CPT eligible scenario. And in this case, because it's a degree requirement and the way that degree requirement is set up, there is no specific enrollment. And then you would have to work with the ON team on making sure that your opportunity meets the requirements and is within the boundaries of that degree requirement. If you've got an offer to work on a consulting project with your professor and the client's based outside of the university, depending on the details of how the project is set up, this may be a course-based CPT opportunity. So we would need some more details. So again, this would be a situation where we'd want to get some advising in advance before accepting anything so that we can figure out if this is something we can authorize and what supports need to be in place for that before you can move forward. All right, so who's not eligible for CPT? Pretty much if you've completed all of your degree requirements, then everything except graduation. And this is where it gets difficult to make a solid argument that CPT is warranted. So if you're in a program that is coursework based and you've taken or are taking all courses required to complete that program, you're in your last semester, then it's really hard for us to make an argument that CPT is warranted. If you know that you're considering doing CPT in your last term, and especially if you don't need to be enrolled full-time in your last term, then it's important for you to have that conversation about your CPT and getting that authorized before you request reduced course load. So if you've gone on record and your advisor have gone on record saying this student is taking all needed courses to graduate, they don't need anything else than this, and then you come and ask for CPT, that gets a little bit complicated. So it's best to include CPT in whatever you're going to take, the CPT course and whatever you're taking in that last term if you plan to do CPT in your last semester and you do not need a full-time load to graduate that semester. If the end date on your I-20 is coming up and the CPT opportunity is after that date, again, this is where we'd be in the situation of having a student who needs an extension. So we can only grant an extension of the I-20 if your academic program is not complete and falls within the eligibility for getting an extension. So then you're looking at, this would be better as a post-completion OPT option, and it's not something we can do CPT for. All right, so how much CPT can you use? You know, technically the answer is as much as you want, as long as it qualifies. So CPT is available without limit during your program because it is, it's there for curricular-based practical training. And there's no cap on how much CPT you can use per level. And you can request multiple CPT authorizations during your program. However, if you were to use a year or more, or be granted a year or more of full-time CPT, then this makes you ineligible for your OPT benefit. So this makes post-completion OPT go away. And the Department of Homeland Security perspective on this is that the primary purpose of the F1 program is for you to complete academic coursework, complete a degree program, specific program of study, and not to be employed. So you have to still be making normal progress towards the completion of your program. Each time you request CPT, the eligibility requirements have to be met for the opportunity and for you. So you can use it as much, but because it's curricular, there still has to be that academic tie to your program. How are we counting CPT? So the regulations establish full-time as anything over 20 hours per week. So part-time CPT would be issued for opportunities that are 20 hours or fewer per week. Anything over 20 hours per week would require full-time authorization. And this is based on how many hours are you actually working per week, not the average. So if at any point during your program, you may need to work more than 20 hours per week, you would have to have full-time authorization for that. And when they're counting your use of CPT, they're looking at the days in your grant of CPT. So from the start date to the end date, how many days are included in that, whether you were outside of the country, whether it included holidays or weekends, that's the count of how much time has been used. All right, so there are some limitations. So in general, CPT couldn't be issued for multiple semesters based on a single course. This does vary a bit by program. So different programs at Vanderbilt have different parameters around how they structure their practical experiences and the connection to courses. So, this will vary a little bit based on the program. But in general, each new CPT request would have to be attached to an approved practical training outlet within your program. Extensions may not always be possible. So that's something to remember if you're in a CPT situation, you're actively in an internship and your supervisor asks you, well, can you stay 3 months more? Before you say yes to that, you need to talk with the academic folks in your program to find out if that's something that's even possible academically. And you also need to talk with us to find out if that qualifies. So on our end, we would need to know that there's still an academic anchor, academic necessity for that extension. And then if that's going to extend into another semester, that usually would need to be another application and a second authorization of CPT. In general, when we authorize CPT, it's going to be issued, especially if it's course-based, it's going to be issued along the dates of that term. So if you are taking a course in the spring and you request CPT for the spring semester, usually the start date would be earlier than the start of the spring term or later than the end of the spring term. In some cases, like let's say this is those are the boundaries of the program. They start on this date and it ends on this date. Those are things that you need to communicate to us so that we know that there's a need to make an exception there. Oops. Okay. Changes to your CPT have to be approved before they take effect. So remember that your authorization is based on the specific employer. It's based on the specific location. So if you got your authorization processed for employer A, then at the last minute you decide you'd rather do the opportunity with employer B, you've got to get that CPT authorization updated to reflect where you're going to be working and who you're going to be working for. Same thing if it's already been issued and it's issued for part-time, and then you find out that it needs to be full-time. Before you can begin working full-time, you've got to get that CPT authorization on your I-20 updated. And in connection to that, we wouldn't be able to sort of toggle full-time on and off during the course of the internship. So it can be like, hey, ISSS, let's do the first 3 weeks is part-time, the next 3 weeks is full-time, and the last 6 weeks is part-time. So when you're issued your CPT authorization, it would be part-time or full-time for the whole grant, for the whole duration of the period. Training can only take place during the authorized dates. So yes, you're just getting a piece of paper, but it's just as binding as if you were to get an employment authorization document from USCIS. So you can't start before, well, one, you can't start until that CPT has been authorized and not before the start date that's listed there on your authorization. And you wouldn't be able to continue beyond the end date that's listed there. Okay, so some basic timelines. If your CPT is based on a course and that course is happening in the fall and spring semester, then you need to be enrolled in that course and have applied for your CPT by the end of the add drop deadline or the change period for your program. Now, in some cases, if your program will allow enrollment beyond the end of that change period, and maybe your program has an independent study that you can take, then this is where we would go back to the academic program and have that conversation about if this is still something that you're eligible to do. And then we go from there. In general, the start and end dates would line up with the semester. So if you're applying for spring CPT, we're looking at this next upcoming spring, you're looking at January 10 start date, May 13 end date, and let us know if there are some conflicts with that, and we would go from there. Summer semester, if you're planning to do an internship in the summer, the dates are usually, and it's course-based. You'd want to make sure that you're enrolled in that course by the start of the last available summer term. Keep in mind, if it's course-based, then we would need to see that you're enrolled in that course before we do the authorization. Maximum dates usually for the summer are the start of Maymester through the end of the summer term. If you're doing CPT that's based on a program requirement and doesn't involve a course, so in general, the start dates, the dates would be determined by any requirements that are articulated in the academic requirement. If there are none, then in general, it will line up with the semester dates. And if you're required to participate for a longer period of time and it overlaps, again, that would be done in 2 increments to help, especially if it's full-time, to help avoid going over that limit of full-time CPT. Okay, so enrollment in CPT. So if you are doing a CPT opportunity that's based on enrollment in a course, then you want to be careful that you don't withdraw from that course. So you're enrolled in it, we authorize the CPT. Because that's the anchor for how you qualify for CPT, you can't then drop that course, because then your foundation for the CPT goes away. And then as far as retaking that course or repeating CPT based on that course, that's going to fall back to your academic program and what rules and structures are around internship courses or independent studies. And that'll be course informed or program informed. So if your program allows that, that would be something that we could do. If not, it would have to be a separate course for the second time. In general, keep in mind that full-time CPT isn't usually authorized during the fall or spring unless it's required by your program. So typically full-time experiences would have to be limited to the summer semester. And so the employment, does your opportunity qualify? So again, has to be directly related to your major program of study. You've got to have an identifiable academic anchor. It's okay if it's paid or unpaid. It can be anywhere in the US. If you're not going to be in Nashville, then keep in mind that you still have that address reporting requirement. So if you move to New York for the period of your internship, then within 10 days of moving, you've got to report your address. Then when you move back to Nashville to resume courses, then within 10 days of relocating, you've got to report that address again. So that gets updated in your CPS record. Okay, so then what do we need in order to authorize the CPT? So you've got to have an offer letter, because remember, this is employer specific. So you've got to have the job first. And we would need to see an offer letter on employer letterhead and signed that has the name and address of the employer, location where the training will occur. If you are hired by a third party or a placement agency and they will pay you, but your work is happening at company A, then we need both the name and address of the placement company as well as the name and address of the location of the organization where you're going to be working. And then on your offer letter, we need to know specifically the start and the start date and end date. We need to know how many hours per week you're going to be working so that we can determine if full-time or part-time authorization is needed. And for your start dates, if you get a letter that has an end date that's outside of what's technically allowed or outside of the semester, then again, depending on if this is a requirement or there's a provision for this within your academic program, then we may have to split that up into 2 authorizations depending on how big the overlap is. Okay, so if you get an offer for an internship and it's for remote work. So currently the Student and Exchange Visitor Program guidance for part-time, for remote CPT is still in place. We can authorize that as long as one of 2 things is true. So either the employer or training site has a branch or remote location where you're going to be working remotely, or they have a means for providing remote supervision and training. So if your CPT opportunity is going to involve remote work, then we would need that confirmation from the company that they're going to be supervising you remotely. So this could either be mentioned in the letter. If it's not mentioned in the letter, it could be in an email if they're communicating it to you that way. We just need confirmation of that. And to that note, if some of the required pieces that we need in order to authorize your CPT are not standardly included in the offer letter that you may get from the company, then confirming those in a separate email and then providing both of those to us for your application would be fine. Okay, so establishing a plan for your CPT. Remember that this is there's 2 sides to this coin that are running parallelly. So you're checking with your program. So on the academic side, it needs to be something that's approved. There may be special processes or timelines, so you need to be aware of those. So you're staying in touch with your advisor or academic program folks on the program side. And on the ISSS side, you want to make sure that the opportunity is eligible for a CPT. If there's any question about that, you always want to check before you sign a contract or accept something. Find out what timelines apply to your opportunity and are there any special permissions that are needed there, and make sure that you're on track with the timeline to get enrolled in whatever the course is, if it's course-based, or you're on track to meet all of the requirements on the academic side to be eligible to engage in that opportunity. So then when we look at preparing your request, you've done this first part, you've gone to a CPT workshop. Next, you want to make sure that you've got everything squared away on the academic side, have your offer letter, and then make sure that if it's course-based, you've registered for, or you've got the plans in place to get registered for the appropriate course. And then you're submitting your application in the ISSS portal. I'm going to stop the share for a moment and hop over to the interwebs, and we'll take a look at application. Give me just a moment to get logged in. Okay, so when you log in, you're going to land on your homepage, and you're going to go to search online requests, and you're going to go down to employment authorizations and click on curricular practical training. There's only one term available at a time, so we haven't opened up the spring just yet. And the system only allows you to have one application per term. So if you've already got an application in the system, you'll see a message like this. And then it will take you to the application that you've already started. So your instructions panel is on the left-hand side, tells you everything that you need to do. Your to-do boxes for the application are on the right-hand side. So you want to fill in the questionnaires that give us the information we need. And you want to send a request to the faculty advisor or academic advisor that's signing off on or supervising your opportunity for the CPT. In order for you to submit the application, you have to at least request a recommendation. It doesn't have to be completed in order for you to submit, but it does have to be requested. When we're processing the application, it has to be completed so that we can see that that's been done. So when you open the request recommendation, you'll get a box like this, and you look up your person, and you'll see a page like this where you can type a message to let them know who you are, what this is, what you need. And I'm going to ask Brooke to chime in here real quick and just confirm where these go for ON students.
Those I will get those. So yeah, those will come to me. Glad to review those, and it's like we're done.
And then do we have any data science folks on with us today?
I think we do have at least a few.
Okay. Typically, those requests go to Daniele, but and we can confirm that.
I will do that. I'll confirm that. I'm glad you brought it up.
All right, and then you're going to upload your offer letter and any supplemental emails with the basic details of your CPT. And most importantly, you're going to hit that gold submit button, because until you hit that, we don't know that you've applied and we can't work on that application for you. So I'm going to go back to the slides here. Okay. All right, so your authorization, what you get is a new I-20. On the second page, that has your CPT permission. You want to make sure that you have this before reporting to work, before starting work. If you do not have a social security number, you'll need your CPT I-20 in order to apply for this social security number. And the earliest that you can apply is 30 days before the start of the employment. So that may take a little bit of coordination, especially if you're going to be working physically relocating to another city for the CPT opportunity. Right now, the SSA is not open to the public, so it's taking a bit of time to get an appointment to get in to apply. And that's something that we will work with you on. You do want to keep your CPT I-20s. These are documents that you may have to provide copies of in the future if you apply for other benefits with U.S. immigration, whether that's OPT, STEM OPT later on down the line. So you do want to hang on to these. This is your proof that that activity was authorized. So just to recap, remember that you're the gatekeeper for your status. There are no stupid questions. If you have any doubts at all, it's better to have a conversation and get those cleared up than to make an assumption and find out after the fact that that wasn't quite right. And then you want to make sure that you're establishing a plan for your CPT that accounts for any academic requirements that you have to meet, any academic timelines you have to pay attention to, and that you've got all of your materials in time to timely apply for your application. So we do ask you to partner with us in that application and be a good customer. Don't turn it in on Thursday night and you need to start working on Friday morning. So we ask you to give us at least 5 days to process that. And then we recommend that you turn it in at least 2 weeks before you want to start, in case we have questions or there needs to be any back and forth, then there's no risk of delaying the start of your work. Remember the timelines. Remember that you need that CPT authorization in order to begin working. So you're going to need to have that signed I-20. Right now, we're still issuing documents electronically, so this would be uploaded for you in your ISSS portal. If you're going to be in a different city, remember to keep up with your address reporting while you're doing CPT, and then once you come back to Nashville. And that is it. Any questions?
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
So, I mean, for in-school internships, so we at Owen don't have a semester. I mean, we have a semester system, but it's essentially a mod system, as you know, which is half a semester. And so you talked about the academic anchor, and so does that apply to, like, do you have to get a new academic anchor each mod, or does
Yeah.
one, even if the academic anchor, say for example, I start something at mod 1,
Mhm.
and for the period of mod 2, do I get a new academic anchor, or will that go on till the second mod also?
Thank you for asking. That's a great question. And I forgot to mention that in the slides. So you would not need to have a new anchor each mod. So it's done by semester. So if your anchor is established in mod 1 or mod 2, then that's sufficient for that term.
Okay, thank you. And another question. So, and what about, say, the upcoming winter break? How does that work? Are we allowed to work or not at all?
So that gets a little tricky. Some basic boundaries, like I mentioned, if it is, unless there's something specific in the requirement, usually this is going to occur, the authorization would be based on the term. So it would start with the beginning of the spring term and end with the end of the spring term. Now, having said that, we know that there are companies that have specific programs, and, for a particular cohort, maybe there's an identified start date for that whole cohort. So in the case where there's no flexibility, then we do work with students and programs to accommodate what's required by the internship program that they're in. But in general, you're looking at the start of the semester or the start of the term, the start of the authorization.
Thank you. And one last question. And so right now it's pretty much the middle of the semester, and even the second mod is already started. And so say, suppose I was to start an in-school internship, say next week or like within 10, 15 days. I mean, there's time enough to get the CPT approved, but how does the academic anchor part work right now as we speak? Like even the second mod has pretty much started. And so how does that work?
Yeah, so that comes down to, that's going to come back to your program and the boundaries that exist around the degree requirement, or if it's a course. And it's got to make sense, for it overall has to make sense. So like if you're in the last week of the semester and you want to do an internship, that's going to be a little hard to accommodate because there's not much of the term left. So we might be looking at, is this going to be a spring opportunity? And maybe you delay the start a little bit. So in some ways that's case specific, and we need a little bit more details about what you're trying to do and how that is structured within your program.
Yeah. Thank you, Annette. Thank you so much.